Ah, look now. Oh, look at that.
Wasn't it wonderful, darling? Can't we go back there someday?
Yes, of course, of course.
Ah, look at you. Won't our grandchildren be delighted when they see how lovely you were?
Oh, look at you.
Yes. I see.
Oh, I like that. Look at that.
That's very nice.
Oh, remember that.
Yes.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Anders Sandberg, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford. Welcome to the show today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Well, before this interview got kicked off, I was telling you that you should treat me like one of your students, because the areas that you cover is not only fascinating, but it's incredibly complex and very sophisticated. So some of your research gets into everything from societal and ethical issues surrounding human enhancement to new technologies, as well as looking at specific areas of research like cognitive enhancement. You've looked at kind of a roadmap for whole brain emulation to neuroethics and global catastrophic risk. I mean, the list goes on, and it's just mind-boggling. Including enhancements to cognition, applied epistemology, philosophy of risk. I mean, there's so many areas that you look into. So I wonder, is there an area that you like to start first?
Well, the explanation of how I can get away with this is, of course, that technically I'm part of a philosophy department. And philosophy started out as that area where people were trying to think about how the world worked. And gradually, some parts of philosophy got their act together. They actually found out important ways of understanding and untangling the world. And eventually, they got names like natural science and history and psychology and sociology and economics, and moved out and got their own departments and their own funding. And everybody still looks at that inchoate, messy area of philosophy and wonders, what have philosophers ever done for us? Now, I'm not really a professional philosopher, even though I'm in the philosophy department. I'm trained as a computational neuroscientist, but I've always been curious, and I've always been really interested in the future, trying to figure out what can we know about it, or can we try to shape it in a useful way? Or the things we know are good innovations that we should aim at, or the things that are really bad that we should try to avoid? And can we know this certain enough that we can actually make a sensible choice?
I think there's a lot there, right? So, I think one of the things that I want to explore today is some of the scholarly frameworks or methodologies by which you look at some of these and ask these types of inquiries. But for the audience that are listening that are not familiar with these domains at all, let's first start with defining transhumanism. What is it, and how should we frame human enhancement?
So humanism was the idea that showed up during the Renaissance and Enlightenment that, humans matter. It's not just about God and the hereafter, but we can actually make this world better. And in particular, the human condition can become better by rational thinking, education, and a better society. Transhumanism then says, but we also age and our brains are not that good. Couldn't we upgrade those? We can use our technology to upgrade ourselves biologically and mentally. And this is, of course, where many traditional humanists get a bit worried, because they certainly think reading a good book might develop you, but taking a drug to make your memory better, is that the same thing, or is that different? So at this point, we get into a lot of very interesting ethical and philosophical debates, which is one of the things I've been doing. But transhumanism as a movement started to show up in the 19th century. and then gradually became something that named itself and really got into its own in the late 20th century. So now there are various transhumanist organizations, but also a lot of people who would never call themselves transhumanist, but are still researching ways of improving the human condition, figuring out how to stop aging, improve our minds, or build artificial intelligences to augment our thinking.
Now, there's a lot of different interesting topics. Of course, I'm sure you look at all of them from, you mentioned some of the chemical aspects that can enhance the brain, but also things like brain-computer interface, those that are non-invasive to semi to invasive. It's interesting. I think there's one startup that used to compete with Neuralink. They have kind of switched over to more external, cap that actually tries to understand, some of the brain signals. But I mean, and it gets very extreme to something like mind uploading to some substrate, including robotics, for example. Can you talk about the different kind of areas of transhumanism, and what are the kinds of questions that you're exploring and asking?
So the really original idea that is really ancient, literally thousands of years old, is, of course, couldn't we do something about aging and disease? So there has long been a human interest of figuring out how to be healthier or even stop aging. And we're starting to get towards the biotechnology that actually might make this work. At least in the lab, there are ways of slowing down aging in lab animals. And commercially, there is a real influx into firms trying to develop treatments that might actually one day be quite revolutionary for medicine. I already mentioned another aspect, and that is, of course, improving the brain. After all, it's underlying most of our lives in a very profound manner. And that might range from cognitive enhancement, but also questions like mood enhancement. How can I actually feel good? Versus other forms of improvements like connecting to computers. So cognitive enhancement and life extension are the obvious ones. There are some people, of course, who also think that, my body is not colorful enough and I want to change my appearance. I have a decided lack of tails and maybe I would look good with scales. So there are some people who want to modify the normal appearance. Others, of course, shudder immediately at this thought. But there is, of course, a big body modification subculture that think that this is a way of expressing oneself, not just by hairstyle and the interesting dressing, but actually by having a forked tongue or looking like a lizard. Now, the interesting part here is that you can also do enhancements of the body, like adding new senses. A friend of mine implanted a magnet so he can sense magnetic fields. There are others who got electronic devices that allow them to respond to earthquakes or the magnetic north, or maybe even if there's good Wi-Fi networks in the vicinity. And the fun part is many of these things are a bit niche activities. And people tend to forget that we're also already kind of transhuman because we're all lugging around our smartphones that already connect us to this global information network where we're never alone. In principle, we don't have to forget because we can record everything we're experiencing, and we're never lost because we're kind of connected to the GPS network. In many ways, our normal lifestyle is already somewhat beyond what many people were dreaming of in the start of the transhumanist movement, because we're already pretty enhanced. We're partaking of a globalized technological immune system in form of vaccines, and we're connected to the internet. In many cases, people are kind of 24/7 sitting or sleeping with their phones. Indeed, many people are using the phones to monitor the sleep, which I find hilarious because the phones are also one of the main causes that you lose sleep. So we're already embedded in this technology, and I think our medieval ancestors would say, whoa, you're already kind of slightly beyond what we would call human. Now, thinking about brain interfaces, that's an interesting issue because right now I'm communicating with you by flapping my mouth parts and making sounds, but then get converted into electronic signals and then reconverted and then send a sound to you. There is a lot of conversion going on here. Information is getting lost. Wouldn't it be better to mind-to-mind interface? Or that I could just store my thoughts about all these questions and the listeners could just download it. Similarly, if I want to express something, why do I have to type on a keyboard? So many people have loved the idea that maybe we could just have electrodes on the brain or in the brain that just transmits this. That's, however, also quite tricky because brains are very messy things. And implanting anything into the body means that now you're at war with the immune system. The whole point of the immune system is get rid of stuff that's not part of yourself. And it doesn't know that you now want to declare your latest gadget a part of you. So you need to construct it so it doesn't rile up the immune system, and also can talk to the messy biology, which again didn't evolve to be easy to read. It just evolved to be very functional. So the end result is that we need a lot of tough research to do it for invasive implants. Non-invasive implants you just put on a skull cap have another problem. They need to read the subtle activity of millions and billions of neurons from the outside. That's not easy either. But again, we are pretty ingenious at these things, and I have seen quite impressive advances over just the past 20 years.
I think one of the things that I'm picking up from you is just a variety of things. And I think when we think about transhumanism, it just isn't something that is necessarily wearables on us or inside of us, but it can be near us as well, like the smartphone example you provided. But the field is so broad because you're talking about everything from cell programming to mini CRISPR gene editing to all sorts of other forms such using aging as a biomarker itself in terms of metformin with some other combination of drugs that's already been approved to see if it enhances longevity, for example. So there's a wide spectrum of things that you're looking at. Now, all of these things are really fascinating, and of course, that's a specialized field in itself. But at the end of the day, just because we have the tools or we're starting to develop those tools doesn't mean that we should be using them. And how should we frame up the lens by which we ask the questions that have ethical, moral aspects?
You may also like our quarterly Astor Perkins event that brings some of the most notable experts and category-leading startups in their area of sustainability and human survival on Earth and in space. To register, visit astorperkins.com/events.
Yes, and this is how I ended up in Oxford, because right back in 2006, there was this in a European Union sponsored project about the ethics of human enhancement. And that's how I actually ended up in the philosophy department. And you can approach this in different ways. One approach might be to be a consequentialist and say, well, do these proposed enhancements improve your life? Do you get happier? Do your life work better? So that is a consequentialist approach. And then you have a deontologist who are trying to, from their armchairs, tell you that you shouldn't do that because that's wrong. And why something might be really wrong might be, for example, that it fundamentally changes you. Maybe the right kind of lobotomy might make me a very happy person, but it's not my original me. It's a new person who might be very happy, but it might be that I'm losing myself. There might be more subtle things. If I take personality-altering drugs to modify my personality, if I do that too much, I might lose something important. So critics of transhumanism, like Francis Fukuyama, he tried to throw all the arguments on the wall and see what stuck, basically. His book, Our Post-Human Future, is a beautiful catalog of arguments. I think many of them are really bad, but we had to respond to them, which I think is actually a very healthy situation. Because it's pretty clear that sometimes enhancement is not the solution. Sometimes we enjoy taking a glass of wine to be less sharp. Sometimes it's actually a very good idea to dull oneself. Sometimes you want to focus your attention, but not always. Sometimes you need to spread it out and be more relaxed. Understanding where this makes sense and where it's problematic is important. In particular, it seems like one issue is how do we relate to other people? If we have a society where everybody can enhance themselves for high performance, doesn't that mean that a lot of people will feel a competitive pressure to enhance themselves too, even if they feel queasy about it? We already seen that to some extent in the debate about vaccination against COVID-19. I actually feel like the people who don't want to take a vaccine have a point. They don't want to alter the body for various reasons, which might be more or less good, and we should accept that. Except, of course, that you also pose a danger to others. Mm-hmm. It's another thing if we debate whether I should be taking my cup of coffee or not. That's going to mostly affect me. I might have a competitive advantage against the non-coffee drinkers, but it's a relatively small one. So here we need to negotiate what we find acceptable and not acceptable. And this is, of course, very obvious at the university. Do we want students taking cognitive enhancer drugs? Well, if the goal of a university is to cram in as much knowledge as possible, it seems to be a no-brainer, pun not intended. They should be doing it. But if it's about ranking them for knowledge and skill, maybe this is distorting things, and it might even be unfair. In sports, generally people think that we don't want drugs there, partially because of unfairness, partially because we're concerned about health, and partially because maybe it's against some hazy spirit of sport. But then again, some sports are more like monster truck racing, and maybe we should just let everybody take whatever drugs they want and instead regard that as part of the spectacle. So a lot of the philosophical work consists of looking at the situation, saying, what's really moving here? Why do we care about it in this particular way? And is that reaction actually sensible? Sometimes it is. Sometimes we can understand something deeper by picking it apart, like the sports situation. Sometimes it just turns out that that initial disgust and yuck that people feel for some form of enhancement might just be badly founded. We should just learn to get over it. So I'm trying to go through various proposed enhancements this way and try to see, are there good reasons against them? Are there good reasons for them? After all, if I were to go to have surgery tomorrow, I would probably want to have an enhanced doctor. I would want him to be very steady on the hand with his scalpel and presumably taking a cognitive enhancer so he wasn't sleep deprived. But we might have different views here, and there might even be trade-offs. After all, gunship crews taking stimulants might be better at being alert, but might also overreact and use the guns when they shouldn't. So there have been other cases where we might say, actually, we want people to be less enhanced in those situations.
So it brings up a lot of interesting questions in terms of the rigor of some of these critical analyses. But I wonder how either culture, values, and also even time period, in terms of historical time period, that of course is associated with the values and principles aspects, how that over time changes some of this kind of thinking process. And so let's say, for example, some of these things that you and your other researchers are wrestling with, would you have ended up in a certain analyses or net result that would differ, say, 100 years ago from, let's say, 100 years forward, for instance? And also, more importantly, what are the kinds of questions that we're not asking, or should we be looking at it differently? And if so, how?
Yeah. So certainly there is changes in culture over time, but I also think there is a kind of philosophical progress. It's not so much that the philosophers are moving forward as they're digging deeper. They're in the same spot. Many of the questions philosophers deal with today at the philosophy department would have been totally familiar to the ancient Greek philosophers. But we have techniques and methods and frameworks that are actually quite advanced. So I think some of these considerations we might actually reach the same conclusions in, even if we did it 100 years ago. There is an interesting analogy, of course, with the history of medicine. When anesthetics started coming out, many people said this is unethical. The Bible says that women are supposed to give birth in pain, and kind of escaping pain, that's unnatural. This is kind of a weird thing to do. And over the years, we've gotten used to painkillers, where we realize actually avoiding pain is a good thing. It might even be a right for many patients that we should give them pain relief, especially in certain very bad states. We also discovered that not all painkillers are good ones. There are risks of addiction. There is a shape to the domain. And we today have an understanding that was very different from Victorian thinkers. Yet I think even back then, philosophers would have probably noticed that, yeah, pain by its nature is something we want to avoid. And there seem to be good reasons to avoid many forms of bad pain. Similarly, when we might look at enhancement, is there a good reason to live a long and healthy life? I think most people would, throughout history, say yes. Or the particular means that might be problematic to achieve it. Yes, but that might be if you need to drink the blood of virgins to live long, then you have an ethical problem. But if it's just doing the right breathing exercises or doing the right gene therapy, that might not be the same thing. Different cultures, however, put different emphasis on things. So the classic form of ethics that was very popular in ancient Greece was virtue ethics, which was very person-centered. It was very much about how do I live a courageous life? How do I master the vicissitudes of life so I don't suffer too much? Now, virtue ethics is making a bit of a comeback, but it has this drawback compared to consequentialism and deontology of other two big schools. It's all about me. It's all about how I should be doing. I can tell you to be virtuous, and you get to try to be virtuous, but it doesn't help us tell what society should be like. Meanwhile, the utilitarians will try to do a big calculation on how to make society as happy as possible, which might appeal to the planners. While the deontologists from the pulpit might tell society, we must not do this because that would be bad for human dignity. So we have developed tools that work on this. Now you might say, well, what about Chinese ethics? When I went to a bioethics conference in China a few years back, I was a bit disappointed to find that Buddhist and Taoist bioethics, there was some sessions on it, but they were kind of small specialized things because most of the people were just doing a riff on Western bioethics. But there is this interesting discourse on different takes on it. How important is it that you're in harmony with society compared to your own value? In the West, we put much more value on the individual, while in China, they would say, actually, society matters way more. So you might actually tilt a bit of the ethical calculation. There is an interesting debate here about the natural order. What normative importance does it have? Is it wrong to change the way the world works? And of course, conservatives throughout the world would say yes, but for very different reasons, whether they're kind of religious conservatives or environmental conservatives, or just think that there is a particular structure life must have. This is often where we transhumanists end up in a big argument, because we think that there is no normative power in the natural order. We might improve on that. Just because nature gave us cancer and aging doesn't mean we need to accept that.
Mm-hmm. I love this conversation in so many ways. I wonder, in the case of from a policy perspective, looking at something concrete, like for example, whether we think technically it's feasible or not, is the ability to mine, upload, or download information, and at some point it becomes the internet of humans in that context. The ones that actually have the means to get connected, again, assuming that it's stable and production grade, they're going to have almost infinite amount of knowledge, but more than knowledge is computational power. So one individual that has that leg up could pretty much create corporations, businesses, and so forth, right? So in that context, I mean, how do we start to kind of structure in such a way that there's equity? So again, not sure if I'm making perfect sense, but how do we create the kind of policy so that we don't have skewness in terms of potential power and distribution of wealth?
Don't forget to visit astroperkins.com to register for our next quarterly events. Past and current speakers include Damian Vaughn, former NFL player, Neil Gregory, Chief Thought Leadership Officer at the IFC World Bank, and many more. To register, visit astroperkins.com and click on Events.
Yeah, so this is of course also a very common argument even against garden variety enhancers. In theory, if I were taking the right kind of stimulants, I would be a much more productive academic, more likely to get appointed professor and get a fancy position, etc. So it seems like already that would mean that we might have a rich get richer situation for enhancers, even though in reality, most of the current enhancers, when they're gadgets like smartphones and pills, costs come down exponentially. It's the services that are expensive. If I need to upgrade myself by going to some kind of spa where they massage my brain or do something, I need to pay those doctors and nurses, and that's going to be expensive. I always felt this is a very important realization. I got it from Ramesh Nam, who is a fellow transhumanist and futurist working more in the energy sector. If we want to make something that is way easier to distribute, we should try to make it a gadget or a pill or something like that. Everything that is a service or requires some service to be really good is going to tend to be expensive and tricky. Sometimes it might still be worth trying to provide. Education, after all, is a service that we pay enormous amount of money as a society to give. But there might be even a moral reason to try to figure out how much can we automate education? How much can we automate healthcare so it becomes accessible for more people? That might still be bad news, of course, for the doctors and nurses. They might not like if they're more medical robots, although most likely they would move on to do the high-value services and the trickier cases. But it looks like this transformation from a complex service into a commodity is important for creating equity. There is still this potential that if I'm enhanced enough, I might see opportunities and do things in the world that others cannot do. And to some extent, we're already having that. I remember when you started a company, you need to go to particular in the government offices and fill in pieces of paper. And you would need to move between the complicated sets of offices and send mail. It would take a long time. Now, of course, most company creation, you can do that in an afternoon, more or less, with a computer and the internet. We're speeding this up a lot. And to some extent, you might say that's even democratizing it. If it took you a week to start a company or longer, then many people would not be able to afford that time. While if you can do it with an afternoon in a computer, it becomes more accessible. The problem is, of course, it also requires those skills and motivations, and they might be harder to redistribute. I think many worries about inequality always contain this idea that we need to redistribute something. Mm-hmm. And the problem is there are many important things in the world that we cannot easily redistribute. Sometimes technology might change it. Rawls, in his famous On Justice, argued that, well, we need to redistribute some things for justice reasons. But he noted that genetic endowments, well, we just have random genes and some of them are probably going to be better than others. We can't do much about it. But he noted that, well, in the future, maybe we can update that. And maybe then we have a moral argument that maybe a welfare system should also give you slightly updated genes if you need to. Of course, that makes a lot of people shudder because they right now regard genes as part of who you truly are, and changing them seems very problematic and is slightly eugenic. But it might very well be that this might be the big liberal cause in some decades down the line. So it seems like it might not be just redistribution, it might be also enabling easy ways of accessing it. Whether that would be to make smartphone systems or ways of getting access to good tutorials, or even people finding other people who can help you. I think it's not redistribution per se, and it's not going to be new technology per se. We're inventing new tools for coordination. The final part is, of course, also keeping bad activities down. The main reason most people don't commit crimes and the evil acts all the time is not so much that the police will catch them. It's that the inner policeman that we got by being reared by normal people, having parents tell us what's right and wrong, reading a lot of fiction, knowing that I care about my reputation. If it comes out what I might do, I don't want to do that. There are economic incentives for playing right. That ensnares us in a network that actually makes us behave ourselves rather well in society. So the final part here might be that in an enhanced world, we need to make sure that we actually have the right incentives to play nice, that we have the right incentives for the people who do really well to share some of that wealth, some of that insight.
Well, I'm very curious to know what those right incentives are in terms of public policy aspects. We are running a little bit out of time, so we need to skip some of the other very interesting topics we're going to cover on cryogenics and cryopreservation. Let's skip over to the manuscript, the book manuscript that you're working on. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so much of the research we do at the Future Humanity Institute deals with existential risk, threats that could wipe out humanity or do something equally bad. And quite often people say, why are you even going up from bed every morning when you deal with such dark topics? And the answer is, of course, we're really optimistic. We actually think the future could be awesome if we survive and get our act together. That's why we're working on all the dark stuff. So my book is about the bright stuff. Basically, assume we survive and get our act together, whatever that means. What could we expect? How good and big could the future be? So I'm trying to look at what do we know in terms of the laws of physics, that how rich we could be in a material sense. What are the limits for amount of services we could get from automation? How sustainable could we be? How long could we live on Earth? How far could we settle space? And how long into the history of the universe could we survive? And what could we turn into? How much computation is possible? How much insight is possible? And of course, depending on different value theories, what should we be doing given all these possibilities? As you can guess, it's a pretty big book. The manuscript right now is 1,360 pages. It doesn't grow quite as quickly as it used to. I'm starting to get to the end of it, but it's still far too much stuff. an editor will probably pick up a chainsaw and shorten it a lot. I have to create a side book just with footnotes of interesting things that will not fit in the main work. But the good story is that it looks like a really grand future is totally allowed by the laws of physics and biology. I think we have a decent chance of making it there. And that's something to look forward to. And that's why we need to kind of fight for making the near future and the far future possible and better, and survive to get to this awesome horizon that we can foresee.
Yeah, I really like the tone of the message, which is, I think oftentimes, especially outside of academia, it's very much a doom and gloom and really speculative risk that may be not based on reality or any type of rigor. I wonder, a couple of questions. Again, I know these are fairly basic questions, but as we evolve from different species and the ability to actually harness different levels of energy so that we're going into deeper space and eventually consuming the energy sources of planets and universes, the reality is at some point, everything decays and the universe, even the various suns and systems will start to decay and will die off. When there is no more energy left in whatever this entire universe is, will we survive, or would and the other question I have is, which is again a very basic question, is should we survive? So is there a finite period to which it is good for us to survive, and it's positive, but are we pushing it too far, trying to live as gods at some point?
So I think the interesting thing about the universe is that we have understood since the 1800s that it looks like we have this looming entropy problem. Eventually, there's going to be the heat death of the universe when there's no more extractable energy, and that looks like the end. It's also rather far away. So when I analyze how far into the future you could actually have our kind of life surviving, it looks like we can definitely survive the end of the stars. In fact, we can make a lot of more energy by feeding the stars into black holes and extracting that energy. In my calculation, it looks like the ultimate curtains for our kind of life is something like beyond 10 to the power of 36 years in the future, when matter itself starts decaying because of proton decay. And there might be ways around that because we actually have never observed proton decay. But it looks like it's a finite future. It's just that it's so mind-boggling vast that for most practical purposes, it's infinite.
Mm-hmm.
And then some people say, yeah, but finite, that means that it's essentially just as small as anything. And I think that's a mistake. We might say that somebody living 70 years and somebody living 70 million years both live a finite lifespan. But you can do quite a lot more in 70 million years than in 70 years. And I think that span might actually matter. But it might also be that the value eventually levels off. Where some people are satisfied after living a certain length of time and they'll say, okay, I'm fine now, and now I don't need to go on. There are others who keep on ticking. A lot of it depends on your goals. And this is where we get to the complicated question, what kind of value theory is true? And some relativists might say, no, there is no true value theory. It's up to different people and different civilizations come up with different answers, which might mean that they might decide to not go on for a long time or go on for a very long time. Moral realists, on the other hand, say, yeah, there is probably some truth to the matter. And then we disagree about what that truth is. It seems to me that there are a bunch of theories that are very happy with keep on going as long as they can. Make as much happiness as possible, or think as deep thought as possible. While others would say, yeah, we want this. And once that's done, we're kind of happy with it. The real challenge is rather to have them coexist. It might very well be that we want to create a utopia where some people are having tea with the vicar while the friends are playing cricket on the village green in some idealized British village, while others are becoming post-humans, moving planets and stars and building great things. And others are just turning entire galaxies into very happy minds. If we can coexist, then we might have a good chance of kind of hedging our moral bets. Maybe it's only one of these theories that actually produce value, but if we do all three of them, then at least we get some of it. There are a few gloomy philosophers who think, no, we don't deserve it. So actually existing is pain. We shouldn't exist. We should all just lie down and die quietly. But that is a decision that you want to consider very carefully, because if you do it, you don't have any other options. maintaining your options for the future is so valuable. So I'm trying to not take too much sides in this conversation, but I'm trying to outline the different views that you can have and which ones are compatible. You might kind of see this as the future political alliances between the people who want to have in the far future versus in the near future. Some people might want vast galactic resources, others might be just happy to see life on planets. Mm-hmm. In short, there is a lot of options. We're not close to them yet. After all, we're still having trouble getting rid of fossil fuels, and we need to figure out a way of being more tolerant of each other on this planet and avoid nuking ourselves and making badly programmed AI. We have a lot of problems because we're just out of the caves. We're right at the start of history right now. And that gives us a tremendous responsibility. And also, we are not very wise. The future generations, they will know stuff we don't know, including what they ought to be doing. But we have this advantage. We're here right now. So that's up to us to make sure that there's a better chance for a really long, open, grand future.
Well, this has been absolutely delightful, and I've so enthralled by what you shared, and so exciting. There's so much to discuss. Would love to have you back at some point. Today I've been joined. Today I've been joined by Dr. Anders Sandberg, who is a senior research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.